His officers whispered that he'd finally cracked. Some said stress had snapped his mind like frozen branches. But on a viciously cold morning in December 1944, deep inside the snow-choked Ardennes, where white drifts hid blood and the Reich hurled its last gamble into the dark, Private First Class James Henderson of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion pulled off something no manual, no commander, and no sane man would have ever approved. Something reckless enough to look suicidal. Something brilliant enough to save every soldier still breathing beside him. Something so unpredictable that the most feared sniper cell in that forest found themselves outplayed on their own terrain. The German officers who later heard the tale didn't call it courage. They called him ein Idiot. The date was December 16, 1944, the opening punch of the battle that would be called the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's final attempt to splinter the Allied line and squeeze one last victory from a war already sliding out of his fingers. For the men of the 333rd, one of only 2 black artillery units fighting in Europe, this was the day when the quiet Belgian woods stopped being quiet. And when the enemy came, they didn't come gently. They came like a storm tearing roofs off. Houses, panzers grinding through villages that had never even seen a tank. Paratroops drifting out of the sky like ragged winter birds. And then the Shadow's German snipers, who moved through the trees like the forest itself had decided to start killing. These weren't ordinary marksmen. They were Gebirgsjäger mountain troops hardened in alpine cold. Soldiers trained to become statues in snowbanks, to hear the wind shift before it shifted, to place bullets precisely where a heartbeat lived. Dressed in white smocks, they blended into winter so perfectly that many men died without ever knowing who shot them. And those ghosts were hunting. James Henderson was 23, born under the muggy skies of Greenville, South Carolina. He'd grown up firing his grandfather's old rifle at soda cans on fence rails, learning how to breathe with the weapon instead of against it. But he learned something else too, something more brutal and more useful. Every day of his life, the world would assume he wasn't smart enough, fast enough, or worthy enough. So if he wanted to survive, he needed to observe harder, think quicker, and act before others even realized there was a decision to make. Drafted in '42, he'd been sent to Fort Bragg, where black soldiers trained apart, ate apart, existed apart. White officers lectured that men like him lacked the discipline for frontline combat. Henderson didn't argue. He simply learned faster and kept his mouth shut. And then his moment arrived in a frozen Belgian ravine, drowned in fear. When the German offensive slammed into the American positions, the 333rd shattered. Radios went dead. Roads were sliced apart by tanks. Units splintered like glass under boots. Henderson ended up with 11 others, men from Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, black soldiers who'd never expected to be fighting so close to the front. They crouched in a narrow ravine filled with ice, listening to German voices echo above them, watching shadows move through the trees as snipers took positions on the heights. Then the dying started. Thompson took a round through the throat while trying to fix the radio handset. Garcia collapsed face first into the snow, reaching for the canteen beside him. Williams never even saw his killer. The shot punched through his cheek and spun him like a ragdoll. Nobody dared move. Every faint crunch of shifting snow summoned a bullet. The snipers were patient, waiting for fear to force someone to lift their head. Henderson lay flat, face numb against frozen earth, fingers tight around his garand. He watched his friends bleed into the snow. Something inside him didn't fracture, it hardened. His whole life had been shaped by people telling him where he didn't belong, what he couldn't do. Now these hidden assassins believed they held all the control. They expected predictable terror, and Henderson suddenly understood something icy and sharp. The snipers didn't think he mattered, they saw him as prey. And prey behaves in patterns. He turned to Corporal Davis, the ranking man left alive. "I'm gonna do something stupid," Henderson murmured. "Don't chase after me. Just be ready." Davis looked at him like he was listening to a ghost speak. "You move, you're done." Henderson exhaled a thin cloud of frost. "I've made it. Through worse. Not stopping now." And then he did the impossible. He rose right into the open. Right into the killing lanes of 3 sniper nests. And he walked forward through the snow like he was strolling down a quiet southern road. No diving, no scrambling, no panic. Just a slow, steady march. The men behind him waited to hear the crack of a rifle. But it didn't come. Snipers are trained to anticipate instinctive reactions. They know the flinch, the low crawl, the desperate dash from tree to tree. Their entire craft is based on predicting fear. But Henderson wasn't moving like someone being hunted. He moved like he belonged on that white stage. And for 3 miraculous seconds, it froze them. He'd counted on exactly that pause. As he walked, he didn't stare directly at likely hides. He scanned the forest for the signs his grandfather had taught him to trust. A branch bent in the wrong direction. A shadow that refused to match its tree. Snow lying too smooth over something too angular. It wasn't about spotting the sniper. It was about spotting the world bending around something unnatural. On his 4th step, he found it a small crease in a white smock on a slope 40 meters away. Under that fabric was a sniper watching him through her scope, confused by a man refusing the script. Henderson gave her a small grin, lifted his hand like tipping a hat, and dove sideways. 3 shots cracked. 2 slow. Rolling, he brought his Garand up and cracked off 4 rounds. 2 searching shots. 1 into the nest. The last one into the sniper, Obergefreiter Greta Extend, before she even realized the trap she'd fallen into. The illusion of invincibility shattered instantly. Davis saw the second sniper's muzzle flash and blasted the hide clean. Another German tumbled out of the brush. The last sniper tried to flee a fatal error. 5 American rifles cut him down in seconds. Then silence returned, thick and eerie, the kind that always settles after violence. Henderson stood and trudged toward the bodies. The first sniper, a woman in her 30s, lay with her blonde hair stiffening with blood, blue eyes fixed open at the clouds. Henderson had heard rumors Germany was drafting women now. Seeing her, there didn't spark guilt, just a hollow recognition that this war was chewing up everyone it touched. The second sniper looked like a schoolboy playing soldier, drowning in a uniform 2 sizes too large. The third was older, seasoned, probably the teacher guiding the pair. Davis joined him, breath pluming out like steam. "How the hell did you know that would work?" Henderson looked down at the woman's rifle, a pristine Kar 98K paired with a Zeiss scope so clear it seemed to look back at him. These 3 had been experts. But expertise loses to unpredictability. "I didn't know," he admitted. But staying put was just a slower way to die. Sometimes the dumb idea is the only one you've got left. They gathered whatever gear they could carry and moved out. The forest still swarmed with German patrols. Nobody knew if the American lines still existed or if they'd been swallowed whole. But the men who watched Henderson walk at snipers like he owned the ground now followed him with a stunned sort of trust. "You just strolled at M," Davis muttered. "They expected us to hide," Henderson replied. "Folks been expecting me to hide all my life. I'm tired of that." They had never imagined facing a man shaped by a world that seemed designed to crush him from the day he was born. For all their training, their icy patience, their perfect camouflage and sniper discipline, the one thing they could never prepare for was a soldier who had already spent his entire life learning how to endure forces far more suffocating than a battlefield full of rifles. Henderson didn't just survive because of a split-second decision or a stroke of luck. The truth ran deeper than that, so deep that even he had trouble putting it into words. His advantage wasn't chance. It wasn't recklessness. It wasn't madness or some wild impulse sparked by fear. It was something forged long before the Ardennes, long before the snow turned red and the forest filled with ghosts. It came from a lifetime of being told what he was allowed to be, where he was allowed to stand, how far he was allowed to dream. Every whispered insult at Fort Bragg, every sideways glance from an officer, every reminder that men like him were expected to load shells, cook meals, drive trucks, never lead, never outsmart, never outfight, had sharpened something inside him. It built a quiet fire behind his ribs, a constant pressure that pushed him to see angles others didn't, risks others feared, paths others ignored. So when the world around him collapsed, when his friends died in the snow, when snipers hunted them like animals, when every rule of survival screamed stay down, Henderson didn't give in. He didn't fold the way the world expected. Instead, he did the one thing the enemy hadn't planned for. He refused to behave like prey. Every step he took through the killing ground was the product of an entire lifetime of learning not to accept the role that had been forced onto him. Where another man might have panicked, where another soldier might have surrendered to despair, Henderson tapped into something harder, older, carved into his bones by years of being underestimated. Sometimes survival demands more than courage. Sometimes it requires breaking the pattern so thoroughly the enemy freezes in confusion. Sometimes the only way through an impossible moment is to do the thing no one sane would attempt, and count on the fact that your defiance will buy you just enough time. The world had told Henderson he was finished long before a sniper's bullet ever came for him. But instead of believing it, he made a decision that defined his entire life. When everything is stacked against you, the only true defeat is accepting the limits others set. What he did that day wasn't insanity. It wasn't a miracle. It was the pure, unfiltered logic of a man who refused utterly and completely to die on anyone else's terms. Henderson survived to see the end. He helped push into Germany and saw the camp's human skeletons draped in striped rags, the monstrous evidence of what they'd been fighting all along. When the war ended, he returned to South Carolina, where the same old racism greeted him like an unwelcome neighbor. He never forgot the 11 men of the 333rd captured near Worth, tortured and murdered by German forces. History mostly ignored them. America hardly whispered their names. They were black, so their suffering stayed buried in cold archives. Henderson carried that weight until he died. Decades later, a journalist located him working in a small garage. The reporter asked if the tale was true, if he really stood up and walked toward 3 waiting snipers. Gray-haired, grease-stained, Henderson smiled the same quiet, almost mischievous smile he'd flashed at that German sniper moments before. Leaping into the snow. When people tell you over and over you're worthless, dumb, less than, and then someone tries to kill you based on that belief, you're left with 2 choices, he said. You can believe them and die proving them right. Or you can do something so out of line they freeze up long enough for you to show them they were wrong. I picked the second. Seemed to work. He passed away in 1997, the medals on his shelf far fewer than the courage he'd shown. His story faded almost entirely until researchers digging through forgotten military records stitched the pieces back together. The men of the 333rd were never meant to be hailed as heroes. They were given support roles, kept away from the front, by officers who didn't trust them. But when everything collapsed, when the line buckled and chaos swallowed the forest, those men fought like warriors who refused to be erased. They held ground no one believed they could hold. They counterattacked. While surrounded, they made a stand where no one expected them to stand, and one of them snapped the grip of elite snipers with a move so insane it redefined logic. Today, the Ardennes stands quiet, snowdrifts clean and untouched. Tourists stroll the trails, listening to guides recite stories about famous generals and big divisions. Few ever hear about Henderson or the 333rd. But the truth persists in footnotes, obscure plaques, and the murmured conversations of historians who dig for the stories that were never meant to be spotlighted. Henderson's act wasn't madness. It was the instinct of someone who understood this brutal truth. Doing what the enemy expects is the fastest road to the grave. For once, he used a lifetime of underestimation like a weapon. The snipers had every edge except the one that mattered. They believed the men they were hunting would behave like frightened targets. They had never expected to face a man shaped by a lifetime of pushing back against forces that tried to crush him long before the German army ever took aim. The snipers in the Ardennes thought they understood the battlefield wind, angles, camouflage, patience, fear. But they didn't understand him. They didn't know what it meant to grow up in a world where every day was a fight to exist, to be seen, to be respected. They didn't realize that Henderson had spent his entire life surviving conditions far colder than the Belgian winter, far harsher than a forest full of rifles pointed at him. By the time he met them in that ravine, he'd already been hardened into something they could not predict. That was Henderson's real edge. Not luck, though some would later try to call it that, as if chance alone could have carried him through that field of fire, not recklessness, though others would claim he acted without sense, ignoring the danger. They never understood that he knew exactly what he was doing, because he knew exactly what the enemy expected. His power came from something quieter, older, and far more dangerous. A lifetime of refusing to accept the limits others tried to place on him. Since boyhood he had been told where he belonged, how high he could climb, what he wasn't smart enough or worthy enough to attempt. Teachers, officers, strangers, even the country he wore the uniform for all had tried to shrink him. Yet every time he found a way to step outside the lines they drew for him, that habit became instinct. Instinct became survival. And survival became defiance. When he rose from the snow that morning, he wasn't just standing up to 3 hidden rifle barrels. He was standing up to everything that ever tried to keep him small. Every voice that said people like him should stay quiet, stay low, stay safe, stay invisible. He had spent his whole life watching others underestimate him. In the Ardennes, he finally turned that underestimation into a weapon sharper than the steel in his hands. Because sometimes, when the world tells you you're finished, when every path is blocked, every escape seems sealed, and every reasonable option leads straight to death, there's only one move left. The one no one expects. The one that doesn't fit the rules. The one that feels impossible. And sometimes, impossibility is simply a door that nobody else is brave enough to open. Henderson walked through it. He gambled everything on the belief that refusing fear was the only chance he had. He stepped out into the open, knowing that hesitation could kill him, but also knowing that hesitation could save him. In that razor-thin space between certainty and chaos, he trusted the instincts life had carved into him, and he lived. Later people would call it madness, courage, desperation, genius. But Henderson always described it simply: a man choosing not to let death or the world decide who he was allowed to be. He didn't rise that day to die. He rose to prove, one last time, that he would never accept defeat on anyone's terms but his own.